Augustus is remembered as Rome's saviour. Nero is remembered as Rome's monster. But what if Nero didn't actually destroy Augustus's system? Instead, what if Augustus's system destroyed Nero? Augustus and Nero, as differing as their legacies may have been, were actually extremely similar men who both encountered similar problems during their political careers. To political battles, to less than favourable family relationships, to dicey marriages, and a constant war against propaganda and later interpretations, the two men were met with the same challenges. However, despite these parallels, both men faced completely different outcomes. Augustus was seen as the restorer of the Republic, whereas Nero was a heartless fiddler. While such claims have slight truth to them, it can be said that the truth is not particularly transparent, nor is it a representation of their true characters, instead political bias. Therefore, it can be argued with a more nuanced perspective, both men actually shared more similarities than differences, and the historical differences are only caused by bad actors' interpretations of the men, which in my opinion can be dispelled with a coherent and developed understanding of classical traditions and themes. Augustus, the restorer of the Republic. With Augustus's final days upon him, his Res Gestae Divi Augusti, the deeds of divine Augustus, had finally been composed, and after his death in 14 CE, was promptly engraved onto the bronze pillars of the mausoleum, upon where his body was rested. This political testament was key to Augustus's image within Rome and the wider empire. Within this piece, Augustus calls himself the restorer of the Republic, and speaks of numerous selfless deeds which he conducted to ensure Rome's development. However, under further inspection, it is revealed by Suetonius, writing 100 years later, that this image wasn't exactly true. This is because Augustus hadn't actually restored the Republic, he'd actually restored a monarchy. Yet this concentration of power did not come without its own civil strife, which Suetonius is not reluctant to point out. During Octavian's rise, he was involved in 5 civil wars. This was Mutina, Philippi, Perusia, Sicily, and Actium. During the Battle of Mutina, it is said that Octavian played a substantial role in orchestrating the deaths of his comrades Pansa and Hirtius, who fought alongside him to defeat Mark Antony. This trickery was the foundation of Augustus's one-man rule, as it set out a very Machiavellian precedent, as in the game of politics, essentially anything is allowed. Another example of Augustus's sadism in the pursuit of power can be seen in the proscriptions of 43 BC, which was the foundation of the Second Triumvirate. This consisted of Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus, and was created after the signing of the Lex Titia, as there was a necessity for political control. During this time, many senatorial factions were executed for supporting the assassination of Julius Caesar. Some of these men had their land and wealth confiscated so that the Second Triumvirate could pay and support their armies financially. One of these men was the influential statesman and politician Cicero, as he was strongly opposed to Caesar and was a believer in the republican style of government. Although Cicero initially supported Octavian, he was later executed. At his command in 43 BC, Cicero was beheaded and his hands were nailed to a rostra in the Roman Forum. This was a symbolic punishment for Octavian's outspoken opposition. Nero, the genesis of a misunderstood tyrant. Similar to Augustus, the young Nero also faced political strife in his early career. For one, both men entered politics at an extremely young age. Augustus was only 18 when he entered politics, following the death of his adopted father Julius Caesar. Yet, Augustus would not become emperor, or princeps, as he would have liked to be known, until the mature age of 35. Nero, on the other hand, became emperor at 16. Unlike Augustus's numerous civil wars in his youth, Nero's most prominent conflict in his youth was with his mother, who was called Agrippina the Younger. More controversial and promiscuous than her son, Agrippina was the great-granddaughter of Augustus. She was the daughter of Germanicus, a beloved general, and Agrippina the Elder, which made her the sister of Emperor Caligula. These early family connections were likely what made her so politically minded, and notorious as it allowed her to observe political power firsthand, which for a woman was extremely rare. At the age of 13, Agrippina entered into a politically vested marriage with Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus and gave birth to their son in 37 BCE. This son would later become known as Emperor Nero. Tragically, Nero's father died 3 years later to natural causes. This left Nero without a paternal figure at the age of 3, but also left Agrippina without a husband, and working her way up the political courts of Rome alone, which eventually culminated in her marriage to her cousin Caligula in 49 CE. During this marriage, and set on political power, Agrippina convinced Claudius to adopt Nero and support him in his heirship over his biological son, Britannicus. She was then granted the title Augusta a year later in 50 CE. This was an extremely rare and prestigious role, the highest honour that a woman could hold in Rome's political system, and it effectively placed her on par with the emperor in terms of political prestige and symbolic authority, and could be seen on coinage of the time. However, due to her being a female in a patriarchal Roman society, she would be unable to hold power over Rome. This meant that in order for her to hold power, it must be by proxy, and the most effective way of doing this would be placing her son, Nero, on the imperial throne. So at the age of 16, Nero was named emperor in 54 CE, after Agrippina employed another woman named Locusta to poison and kill Claudius. Unlike Augustus and Nero's shared experience of having their fathers assassinated, their educations differed, and were a contributing reason why their outcomes differed so much. Unlike Augustus, who was educated among Caesar's political circle, Nero had the unfortunate and lackluster experience of being educated not by politicians, but philosophers. How painful, I know. That would be terrible. Although in a contemporary view, this education was extremely impressive, it was functionally useless in Rome's political society, as philosophers and artists were seen as low as slaves. Primarily, Suetonius writes, Nero's education was studied under the Stoic philosopher Lucius Annaeus Seneca, who was responsible for shaping Nero's education in ethics, rhetoric, government, and, some argue, indoctrinating him into the school of Stoicism. This education started when Nero was at the young age of 8. During this time, Seneca was tasked by Agrippina to turn Nero into essentially a philosopher king, of which this role included the need to imprint virtues of justice, rationality, and endurance of not only the mind, but also the body. However, despite teaching Nero the necessity for a meagre and humble lifestyle, Mary Beard makes sure to highlight that Seneca did not commit himself to these teachings in his personal life, as she accuses him of hypocrisy. This hypocrisy can also be seen in Nero's early speeches to the Roman people, as they are believed to be written by Seneca. This duality between public and private life set a precedent for Nero's political career, which would carry on from this moment, and, like Augustus, set the Machiavellian foundation that was precedent to his career. On the contrary, Augustus's education, which didn't seem in a contemporary sense as impressive and intellectually flourishing, was far more functional for his actual role. This is because from the Res Gestae to classical sources such as Suetonius, and contemporary sources such as Ronald Syme also agree that Augustus's education and his rhetoric was extremely powerful. This skill was acquired because of Augustus's teachers, as they were political people, rather than the bookish and intellectually snobbish, some may say, of an education which Nero received. The other significant educator in Nero's life, and the one that seen much favourably, was Sextus Amphranius Burrus, who was Nero's lead bodyguard. Burrus was not actually a conventional teacher like Seneca, but due to the long hours the pair would spend together, Burrus functioned as a life coach effectively to Nero. This can be seen through his partial yet cautious recommendations on how Nero should run the country. Some theorise that Burrus, given the educational status of Seneca, would have raised Nero to be a better emperor. However, it simply just wasn't the case. Therefore, it can be theorised, due to the pair's differing educations, Augustus was set up to become the undisputed ruler of the known world, while Nero was brought up with the mind of a plebeian but the status of an emperor. A city made of blood, not marble. Regardless of the two men's educations, one thing remained constant: the need for political violence. Augustus and Nero were well acquainted with this fact, and did not shy away from such visceral acts within their political careers. Early into Augustus's reign, it was clear that assassination was unavoidable. This is seen in the Battle of Mutina, where Augustus allegedly played a role in the assassinations of both Hirtus and Pansa. Moreover, Augustus's most brutal and important assassination was one of Mark Antony. Was not technically being an assassination. Antony took his life believing his lover Cleopatra also had done so. However, if Antony had been alive when Octavian found him, it's more than likely Octavian would have killed him right there and then. Like Augustus, Nero was also a key assassin. He notably and most infamously assassinated his own mother at the age of only 21 years old, and was likely due to his resentment over her political power through the tumultuous influence of Seneca. Initially, Nero planned to rig a boat to sink. This would have been a perfect crime, as it could have just been a natural disaster or something normal that could have happened, because boats would sink all the time. However, once the boat sank, Agrippina just simply swam to shore and escaped that attempt. This publicly embarrassed Nero, and in his embarrassment he sent assassins to stab her to death. Tacitus says Agrippina, when she was being stabbed to death, cried out to the assassins that they should smite the womb in which the monster was bred, a dramatic metaphor for Nero's birth. Yet I would argue that the play Octavia, which the author is unknown but most people attribute it to Seneca, or at least part of Seneca's circle, was the source of this myth, as it was believed to be written before Agrippina's assassination, and what enabled Roman historians to retroactively dramatize Agrippina's assassination as a smear attack to Nero's posthumous reputation. However, Nero's assassinations were not limited to his mother, but also extended to Seneca. This guy was on a bit of a killing spree. This is because Seneca was believed to be part of a conspiracy to overthrow Nero. Although evidence of this is flimsy and pretty much non-existent, Nero ordered Seneca to take his own life, which of course was likely a result of Nero's growing political thirst for power. Seneca stoically complied with Nero's ask of him by opening his veins, which was a common way of Romans to commit suicide. And often in Roman culture, it was seen as an honourable way to die. This also meant that the death was prolonged and extremely painful for Seneca. Seneca also took poison and eventually died with the help of his attendants. This was the turning point in Nero's reign, as he had not a mother nor a teacher to help him rule. And this, I believe, sealed his fate. Despite Nero's morally dubious actions, his alignments to the gods shared many similarities with Augustus. For example, both emperors aligned themselves very closely to Apollo. However, Nero decided to align himself with Apollo's cultural values, whilst Augustus aligned himself with his more brutish qualities. Differing from Augustus's blueprint again, Nero aligned himself closely with Dionysus, or Bacchus, and his values of hedonism. Nero did this more so than Augustus, as unlike the poet Propertius in the Temple to Palatine Apollo, which was written in 16 BCE, to Nero, Bacchus was more than just an inspiration to Apollo, as Nero believed Bacchus had a lifestyle which ought to be copied, which Nero's teacher Seneca thoroughly condemned and stated, "What is baser than luxury that thinks of nothing but wine, perfume, and mistresses," which was a convoluted jab at Dionysus's hedonism. Yet it was clear that to win over the Roman public, a one-man ruler would have to do more than simply align himself with the correct gods. Goodness in power. Although a dim picture has been painted for both men so far in this video, Historically, the pair actually did a lot of good, particularly concerning the plebeians of society. In the case of Augustus, in 20 BCE, when he started the construction of the Forum of Augustus, it is said that Augustus forewent a symmetrical shape in favour of an asymmetrical shape. This was so that the common people of Rome, also known as the plebeians, could actually keep their apartments, and it meant that Augustus didn't have to destroy them in order to sustain a certain shape. Augustus also created a grain dole, making sure that the urban poor of Rome were fed regularly and routinely, in order that nobody starved to death. In some cases, Augustus actually funded this himself, showing that he was a benevolent benefactor of Rome. Not only did Augustus support the commoners of Rome, he actually supported those who made his one-man rule possible. This is because he founded a military treasury to pay veterans pensions, which eased the burden on other institutions in Roman society who would pay veterans, but also maintained these veterans' loyalty to Augustus. This gave land or money to retired soldiers, which also helped with settling and farming unused areas of land. Augustus also claimed in his Res Gestae, starting in 28 BCE, that he restored 82 temples. Some of these included the temple to Mars Ultor, Venus Gentrix, and the divine Julius Caesar, among many others. It was also written by Suetonius that Augustus actually lived a very modest lifestyle, living in a small house upon Palatine Hill, where his diet consisted of simple grains and fruits. It was also said that Livia, his wife, actually repaired Augustus's clothes for him, showing that the couple had a very humble and honest way of living, which was like many of the plebeians of the time. This paints a positive perspective on Augustus's one-man rule. However, in the case of Nero, despite his earlier reforms, which more often than not favoured the plebeian class, his decadent lifestyle was said to outshone his earlier kindness. Nero's kindness and good to the plebeians was certainly present during his political reign. Regarding the plebeians, I would argue Nero actually surpassed Augustus in how well he treated them. Due to Seneca's influence, it is said that Nero spent a lot of time with the plebeians, the lows of the low of society, who were often artists, playwrights, actors, and the philosophers. Ironically, in doing so, Nero broke the code of conduct, let's say, of being an emperor by attending these plays and actually acting in them in a drunken haze. Nero was actually one of the first ancient politicians to be extremely anti-corruption, which is often the reason cited for his assassination of his mother. However, Nero did not simply serve his own hedonistic desires, but actually served something much greater: the state. He notably, like Augustus, lowered taxes. Nero also passed multiple laws regarding slaves. This enabled them to have a higher status in Roman society, where they could now file complaints against their masters. Although in retrospect these restores are very small and insignificant in the grand scheme of things, it shows that Nero was far ahead of his own time. It's also said that Nero was quite the diplomat, and unlike Augustus, who had to get Tiberius to do his diplomatic work, Nero could actually do it himself. This act of diplomacy, like with Tiberius, was also with the Parthians, as in 63 BCE, Nero happened to restore peace between the two powerful empires. As well as being compassionate to people, Nero famously adored animals. As Tacitus reports, Nero imposed restrictions on killing animals in amphitheatres in terms of implementing moral laws, and instead replacing it with gladiatorial games. Some may argue this is human brutality just in place of animal brutality. However, according to the histories, it is said that Nero actually staged some of these battles, which allowed both men to walk away with their lives. In contrast, Augustus was known for compiling great games with exotic animals and lots of blood. Whereas Augustus used these games for imperial symbolic power, Nero actually used these to actually just entertain people and to have a good time. Even the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE, of which Nero's fiddling was falsely attributed to him by later historians, was a myth, as the fiddle wasn't even invented yet, nor was Nero even at Rome. It was said that after the fire, Nero was keen to help the people of Rome. and it said that he even opened his palace as a place for victims to recover, and only took the Christians as a scapegoat due to political pressure and needing someone to blame. The descent into lunacy. Due to political biases, mostly from the works of Suetonius, Dio Cassius, Tacitus, Nero, and to some extent Augustus, were painted more monstrous than they actually were. Yet not all of these monstrous events can be summed up to historical speculation or myth-making, as some of them actually took place. However, to some extent, the reasons why these monstrous events took place can be defended. One example of this is the implementation of the Lex Julia by Augustus in 17 BCE. These were marriage laws, and they were nothing short of immoral and hypocritical. They were implemented to penalise adultery and promote marriage and fertility. They enforce strict moral behaviour, targeting adultery and encouraging marriage among the Roman elites. Augustus was so keen to implement these laws, even his family were not spared. Most notably, Julia the Elder and Julia the Younger were both exiled on account of adultery. However, Augustus was simply a hypocrite, as he himself, according to Suetonius, was a notorious adulterer, and even his wife Livia helped to find the women Augustus would sleep with. This began to happen when Augustus was getting older, presenting the image that he was getting quite perverse in his old age. Another notorious event which showed Augustus's descent into lunacy was in 9 CE with Varus, as he was ambushed during a battle at Teutoburg Forest by Germanic tribes. Varus lost 3 legions in this battle, which was a devastating blow to Rome's imperial image. It is said that the growingly unwell and mentally unstable Augustus, upon hearing this news, began smashing his head into a wall, crying out that Varus must give him his legions back. And following this event, Augustus began isolating himself from public life, showing that he was not only deteriorating physically, but also mentally. However, unlike Augustus's mania, which started when he was older, Nero was much younger, as arguably it can be said that it started when he was only 20. Some historians argue that this decline started with the murder of Agrippina, whilst others put it down to the outing of his former teachers. Yet another school of thought would suggest that it was actually the murder of his wife, Poppaea Sabina, in 65 CE. Despite the shocking and visceral nature of this murder, which of course cannot be excused, Nero's character must be understood so we can understand why he murdered his wife. For one, the boy had a tumultuous childhood. His father died early, and his stepfather was assassinated at his mother's hand. Whilst this was happening, Nero's education wasn't fit to rule. He was fit to be a scholar or a philosopher. Therefore, when he eventually came to rule at the young age of 16, he was in a mentally bad state and wasn't educated in such a manner which he could perform to the standards required of the role. Thus, these events would clearly take a toll on his well-being and make him manic. This then led to him killing his wife, who was bearing their only child at the time, which produced a brutal and vicious double homicide. Or at least, this is what the history books tell us. However, it could be argued that this, like Agrippina's murder, could also be a myth. It's quite strange that both stories share similar parallels. Both lethal blows were done to the stomach. Therefore, it could be, and I suppose rather fringely argued, that both murders were products of symbolic Roman tradition and theatre, rather than having extremely substantial historical fact to them. Developing this point further, Nero's reaction after her death does not indicate any contempt or hatred to his wife, as, Nero actually mourned her significantly and publicly. So much so that he had her body embalmed and displayed publicly in order for the Roman population to mourn. Nero also gave her a lavish funeral and visited her grave very often. After a funeral, it is said that Nero was touring the streets of Rome, where he spotted a young boy named Sporus, who resembled his late wife very significantly. Nero, being the extremely reasonable man that he was quite clearly, decided the only logical way to go about his feelings was to kidnap the boy, castrate him, and then make him dress up as though he was his wife and he would appear in public with him. Yeah, from this, it's quite clear that Nero was definitely losing his mind. However, it's not exactly clear whether this is true historical fact or simply another hyperbolic fantasy of later historical writings. This is because, like the two previous murders, Sporus's story actually links with Roman theatre quite a lot, as it was tradition for young boys to play females in plays, as due to the patriarchy women were not allowed to. Therefore, to say that Nero had at one point drunkenly acted in a play where a young boy had played his wife is not too far-fetched. Yet it could be said that the historical uncertainty surrounding Nero's well-being is a metaphor for how he was. It shows that, like the historical documents, Nero wasn't actually certain of who he was. And if this school of thought is to be believed, it follows that his death, like his descent into lunacy, is shrouded in mystery. It is believed that in 68 CE, during the final months of Nero's life, there was an increase in political instability and rebellion, as Nero further isolated himself from public life like the earlier Augustus did. This led to Nero eventually being declared an enemy of Rome and chased out of Rome by the Senate. Fleeing Rome, it is said that Nero uttered the statement, "I have neither friend nor foe." This quote, which is attributed to Nero, follows the school of thought which I have discussed throughout, as the statement is simply categorically incorrect. Nero did have enemies, quite a lot of them at this point, the Senate being the most prominent one. It shows that Nero's madness made him not understand reality. He was extremely disconnected. He lost his mind at this point. This is shown the moment before Nero took his life, on June 9th, 68 CE, as he poetically declared, "What an artist dies in me," before brutally stabbing himself in the throat, which was a visceral ending to a man who was not fit to rule. And also a pretty ironic one, because Nero wasn't an artist, and as well he's celebrating the literal thing which caused him to kill himself. This death as well marked the end of the Julian-Claudian dynasty, the dynasty that Augustus worked so tirelessly to create. Taking everything into account, Augustus's one-man rule was not a system suitable for a man of Nero's upbringing. The boy was traumatized and misled from an early age. The political events as well were no place for somebody of Nero's character to be in his early life. Some may argue Nero wasn't even mad, but an artist that was fated to rule the world, and fated to not be understood. It cannot be understated that Nero was especially disillusioned from the Senate and the high-ranking Roman politicians. He was effectively a misanthrope among Rome's heavy hitters, yet beloved by the common man. Therefore, it could be said in some way that Nero was more like Julius Caesar than he ever was Augustus. Both Caesar and Nero were martyresque in some fashion, but it was only deep historical propaganda that turned Nero into a monster and Caesar into a hero. Therefore, if we're discussing if Augustus's system was good or not, the first question that must be asked is, who is the ruler? If it's a man like Nero, a man of passions, desires, and zest for life, and the finer things, perhaps not. However, if they're like Augustus, rational, politically minded, and a principle of doing what is good for the state, then yes, perhaps they are fit for a one-man rule. Yet, what person in history is remembered solely by their rationality? Very few. And the reason for this is simple. Men are not remembered for their logic and their rationality, but how they make others feel. So, I suppose, to utter Nero's words, it might be better to be an artist than it is to be good. Thank you for watching.